The war was finally over. But for the captured women of Germany, peace did not come with celebration. It came with silence, and the sound of boots echoing across train platforms. In the summer of 1945, hundreds of German female prisoners, nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries, were gathered under gray skies and loaded onto trains heading west. Their faces were pale, their hands trembling, their minds spinning with rumors. Some whispered that the Americans were cruel, that they humiliated prisoners, made them starve, or worse. Others simply stared out the window, too tired to imagine anything at all. Outside, the landscape told the story of defeat. Fields once filled with crops were now fields of ash. Broken churches stood like open wounds. Children watched from the edges of rubble, their eyes wide and hollow. As the train moved through the countryside, the women felt the rhythm of iron wheels beneath them, steady, mechanical, almost comforting. But every mile took them farther from home and deeper into the unknown. At night, when the train stopped, they could hear distant laughter, American soldiers somewhere nearby. The sound confused them. It didn't sound like monsters. It sounded normal. Days later, the women were transferred to a port city. There, they saw something that made them freeze. A large ship bearing the American flag. Its steel hull gleamed in the morning sun. One of the women, Anna, whispered to herself, "So this is how far we've fallen. Across the ocean, even our enemies will decide who we are." They were given water, bread, and a quiet order: board the ship. The guards did not shout. They did not strike anyone. They simply watched, calm and disciplined. It was the first moment of uncertainty, not in fear, but in confusion. The Atlantic crossing took weeks. Storms rocked the ship, and seasickness replaced hunger. At night, the women huddled together below deck, listening to the endless hum of engines. Some prayed, some wrote in small notebooks. Others just stared at the ceiling, waiting for the day they'd finally see what America looked like. When the sun finally rose on the horizon, they saw it. Vast land, endless green, and a sky too clear to belong to war. A few women gasped. One began to cry silently. The ship slowed as it approached the shore. Trucks waited on the docks, lined up neatly like everything else the Americans did. An officer gave a brief command. "Welcome to Camp Huntsville," he said in clipped English, as if it were just another day. For the German women, it was not another day. It was the beginning of a story they never expected, one that would replace bitterness with sweetness and lies with mercy. They did not know it yet, but the journey that began in ruin was about to end with the taste of kindness.
The first thing they noticed was the silence. Not the silence of fear, but the soft, humming stillness of order, of a country untouched by war. As the trucks rolled through the gates of Camp Huntsville, the German women stared out in disbelief. The roads were clean, the grass was green, and the wooden barracks stood in perfect rows like something drawn from a photograph in a propaganda magazine. Except it was real. Anna pressed her fingers against the window pane. She had imagined cages, barbed wire, and the smell of rot. Instead, she saw men mowing the grass, women hanging laundry, and American guards who looked more curious than cruel. The driver stopped the truck. A soldier gestured politely for them to step down. No shouting, no guns pointed, just quiet, efficient routine. Each woman was registered, their names written carefully in English letters. They were given blankets, soap, and, to their surprise, toothbrushes wrapped in paper. Maria, one of the older prisoners, whispered under her breath, "They treat us like guests, not enemies." For For the first time in years, the women could smell fresh air without smoke. The camp was surrounded by pine trees, their scent mixing with something new, something warm and inviting drifting from the distance. It was food, real food. They followed the smell to a long, low building with wide doors, the mess hall. From inside came the clatter of trays and the low murmur of voices. The air was thick with the scent of butter, sugar, and coffee. The women froze at the doorway, unsure whether to step inside. A young American cook noticed their hesitation and smiled awkwardly. "Go on," he said, waving them in. "You'll eat." The prisoners exchanged glances, suspicion, hunger, and pride colliding in a single moment. Then Anna took the first step forward. The hall was bright, rows of long tables stretched across the room, lined with trays already waiting. Steam rose from pots in the kitchen. The smell was almost dizzying. Potatoes, bread, something sweet baking in the ovens. The women sat down slowly, their movements stiff and mechanical. They didn't know whether to look up or keep their eyes lowered. One guard nodded politely, as if this were a normal meal. For him, it was. For them, it was unthinkable. On the table before them sat a piece of bread so soft it almost crumbled in their hands. Next to it, a small bowl of fruit, apples. Bright red, shiny, perfect. Maria touched one gently, as if afraid it might disappear. Back home, apples had become memories. When the first spoonful of food touched their lips, the women did not speak. They only stared at one another, eyes wide, hearts pounding. It was not the taste alone that shocked them. It was what it meant. In this new land, where they had expected revenge, they found abundance. And in that abundance, they found mercy. The moment the first bite touched her tongue, Anna froze. She had forgotten what real food tasted like. The bread was soft, the butter creamy, and the sugar impossibly sweet. For years, her meals had been nothing but gray stew and dry crusts that crumbled like dust. Now she tasted warmth, and it frightened her. Around her, the other women ate slowly, cautiously, as if the food might be taken away at any second. No one spoke. The only sounds were the quiet scrape of forks and the hum of the mess hall fans above. Maria sat across the table, hands trembling. "It tastes like home," she whispered, her voice breaking. Anna nodded, but couldn't speak. Her throat was tight, not from hunger, but from disbelief. At the far end of the hall, the American cooks moved efficiently, serving trays and refilling pitchers. One of them, a young man with a kind face, noticed that Anna's bread had fallen to the floor. Without a word, he brought her another slice, fresh and warm. She looked up at him, uncertain. He just smiled and said quietly, "It's all right." 2 simple words, and in that instant, something inside her cracked. Back in Germany, every lesson, every broadcast, every story had painted the Americans as brutes, monsters in uniform. Yet here was one offering her bread with gentleness. Her mind couldn't process it. If the enemy was capable of kindness, then everything she had believed might be a lie. The room was filled with the scent of butter and sugar, the air thick with warmth and disbelief. Some women began to laugh softly, nervously, laughter that came from shock rather than joy. Others cried quietly, hiding their faces behind their hands. No one told them to stop. Later, when the meal was over, the women were told that they could take fruit with them back to the barracks. Anna picked up an apple, red and smooth, and held it as if it were made of glass. She hadn't seen such color in years. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the camp in gold. For the first time since the war ended, she felt something stir inside her chest. Not fear, not guilt, something lighter. That night,
Lying on the thin mattress of her bunk, Anna couldn't sleep. The taste of butter still lingered on her tongue, haunting and tender. She thought of her mother in Dresden, who had once baked bread every Sunday before the bombs came. She thought of how something as small as a meal could undo years of hate. And she whispered into the dark, "They don't hate us. Why?" No one answered, but deep down she knew the truth. Sometimes kindness is the most disarming weapon of all. That night, under the hum of the camp's electric lights, the first seeds of forgiveness were planted. Not through speeches or surrender papers, but through something far simpler. A meal shared between enemies. Days turned into weeks. The rhythm of camp life became strangely familiar. Morning roll call, laundry, letters, meals. But it was the mess hall that everyone waited for. Every time the doors opened, the smell would drift through the air. Coffee, butter, sugar, cinnamon. The kind of smells that belonged to another world. The women began to laugh more easily now. They greeted the American cooks, sometimes in broken English, sometimes with gestures. And each day, their fear faded a little more. But alongside the laughter came something else, a quiet unease. Because with every bite of soft bread, every spoonful of sweet pudding, came a question that none of them could shake. Why were they being treated so well? At night, Maria wrote in her notebook. "Perhaps," she scribbled, "the real punishment is kindness. They show us mercy, and we must face what we became." The American guards never mocked them. They never reminded them of what their country had done. They simply followed routine, discipline wrapped in decency. And it was that very normalcy that began to sting the most. One afternoon, when Anna was helping to clean the tables after lunch, she caught her reflection in the window. For a moment, she didn't recognize the face looking back. The gaunt, hollow-eyed woman from the journey had begun to fade. Her cheeks had color again. Her hands no longer shook from hunger. She looked alive, and that realization filled her with both relief and guilt. Because outside these fences, Germany still starved. Children rummaged through ruins, mothers traded jewelry for bread, and here she was, a prisoner, eating pie. That night, she couldn't finish her meal. When the cook noticed, he asked softly, "Not hungry today?" Anna lowered her gaze. "Too hungry," she said quietly, "but not for food." He didn't understand, but he smiled anyway. "Tomorrow," he said, "there's always more tomorrow." That line stayed with her. There's always more tomorrow. It sounded like hope, a word that had been buried under rubble for years. As the days passed, the women began to change in small, invisible ways. They started washing their uniforms more carefully. They braided their hair again. They stood taller at roll call. The camp wasn't just feeding them, it was restoring something deeper. But with that restoration came a reckoning. Every act of kindness reminded them of what cruelty had taken from the world and from themselves. Sweetness had become a mirror, and in that mirror they saw both what they had lost and what they might still become. For the first time, the women of the defeated nation realized that mercy carries its own kind of power, a power that makes even the victors humble. And when they bowed their heads to say silent thanks over a slice of warm pie, they weren't just grateful for the food. They were grateful for the chance to feel human again.
The orders came quietly one morning. Repatriation. After months in the American camp, the German women would soon be sent home. For hours they packed what little they had, folded uniforms, worn notebooks, the few letters they'd written but never sent. Yet as they looked around the tidy barracks and the mess hall beyond, many realized something unexpected. They didn't feel ready to leave. That evening, the cooks prepared one last dinner. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. The air was thick with silence, the kind that carries both gratitude and grief. When the women entered the dining hall, they saw the tables set with care. Fresh bread again, butter melting softly, stew thick and rich, and at the end of each tray, a small slice of apple pie. It looked simple, ordinary, but to them it felt sacred. They ate slowly, as though memorizing every flavor, every smell. Each bite pulled them back to that first night, the shock, the disbelief, the tears. Only this time there was no fear, only quiet understanding. Across the room, guards spoke in low voices, their faces calm but distant. They had learned, too, that compassion could exist even between enemies. One of the younger guards, the one from Kansas, approached Anna after she finished her meal. He handed her a small paper bag wrapped in wax. "For the road," he said simply. Inside was another piece of apple pie. Anna froze, her throat tight. "Danke," she whispered, the word trembling. The guard nodded. "You're welcome." For a long moment they just stood there, two people from opposite sides of the war sharing something wordless. Then she turned and walked out, clutching the small bag like a relic. Outside, the trucks were waiting. Engines idled softly in the cool evening air. The camp gates stood open for the first time since their arrival. As they climbed aboard, the women looked back. The mess hall still glowed in the distance, warm and golden against the fading light. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a memory, a symbol, a quiet monument to kindness. As the convoy rolled away, Anna looked down at the pie in her lap. The smell of cinnamon and apples drifted upward, gentle and sweet. She broke off a small piece and tasted it. For a moment, she closed her eyes. She could almost forget the war. Years later, when peace had long returned and the ruins of Europe were rebuilt, Anna would still remember that night. The light on the tables, the taste of the pie, the stranger's kindness. She would tell her grandchildren not about the battles or the hunger, but about the meal that changed everything. Because sometimes history isn't rewritten by soldiers or speeches, but by the quiet grace of one human being feeding another. That night in 1945, under the flag of their former enemy, a group of weary women learned the simplest truth of all, that sweetness can survive even in the ashes of war. And though the war had taken everything from them, it was in captivity, in the land they once feared, that they discovered the one thing no army could destroy: humanity.